This episode is sponsored by Moschio Prosecco. Want to sell sparklers and 187s? Moschio has them in Brut, Extra Dry, and Rosé. Look for the 12-bottle party pack.
Ever wonder how wines are judged at a wine competition? Or how one becomes a judge? Today we go behind the curtain talking to an expert who has been judging and directing wine competitions for over 30 years.
This is Wine Biz 360, in-depth coverage of the wine industry. For wine professionals, by wine professionals. Here is your host, Joe Janish.
Today our guest on Wine Biz 360 is Robert Whitley. And if you've been in the wine business for a while, you certainly have heard of Robert. He has been writing a nationally syndicated wine column since 1990. He's hosted a radio show on wine. He's the founder of Wine Review Online, which is basically an all-star team of some of the most respected and knowledgeable wine writers in the country. And relevant to today's subject, he's the executive director of 4 major wine competitions: the Critics Challenge, San Diego International Wine and Spirits Challenge, the Winemaker Challenge, and the Sommelier Challenge, which is in its 10th year and coming up in September. Robert, I just want to say thank you so much for joining us and sharing your knowledge on competitions and a lot of other things that I'm sure we can talk about.
It's my pleasure.
So before we get into the competition talk, let's hear just a little bit about your journalist career before you got into wine, because I personally find it fascinating. I know that before you had a wine column, you were a sports writer in New York for New York Newsday when the Knicks won their first championship. So you have a pretty interesting career.
When the Knicks were really good. Dave DeBusschere, Walt Frazier, Willis Reed, Red Holtzman was the coach, Bill Bradley. I mean, those were great teams. Yeah, I started my career in Washington, D.C. at a newspaper called the Washington Daily News. It was a Scripps-Howard newspaper, tabloid. There were 3 newspapers in Washington, D.C. at the time. And this would have been about October of 1965. I was 15 years old. I started covering high school sports, and I worked my way up to college and did quite a bit of college sports. And then I started covering pro basketball, the Baltimore Bullets. They're the Washington Wizards now, but they used to be the Baltimore Bullets. And in about 1970, I had an opportunity, and I was 19 years old. I had an opportunity to go to San Francisco, work for the San Francisco Examiner, or go to New York Newsday and cover the Knicks. And I stayed on the East Coast. Now, years later, I'm on the West Coast, but back then I was all gung ho about going to the big city and taking a bite out of the Big Apple, and it was a great experience. And I covered sports in New York for 3 years. Then I went back to Washington. I worked at the Washington Post. I was an editor in the sports department, but I still had a yen to write. So then I had 2 job opportunities, writing jobs. One was at the Miami Herald, and the other was at the Charlotte Observer. And you would think, being a big city boy, I would have just jumped right all over it wasn't the Miami Herald, Miami News at the time.
Sure.
I would have jumped on the Miami offer, but
of course.
But the editor of the Charlotte paper was a fellow named Jim Batten, who later became the president of Knight Ridder Newspapers. Really talented fellow, a big hitter in the newspaper business, and he convinced me to go to Charlotte, where I went for a year. And I covered Atlantic Coast Conference football and basketball, and it was a great ride because those 2 sports in what they called Tobacco Road are just have a huge fan following, and it was a lot of fun. It was very exciting. And then after a year, I decided I wanted to be in a big city again. Now, Charlotte's a big city now, but at that time in the early 1970s, it was kind of sleepy. So I had a friend in Chicago who was moving to Pittsburgh to take the job as sports editor of the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette. And I went there and I covered hockey for 5 years.
Huh.
And then after the hockey beat, I got tired of hockey. I'm not... to this day, I'm not a huge hockey fan, but I enjoyed covering it, and I enjoyed the people, and I really enjoyed visiting the Canadian cities. But I wanted to do something different, so I talked to the bosses at the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette, and I became a national feature writer. So I would go cover the big NFL game every week, or I would go cover one of the big college football games every week. Right. I'd cover the Kentucky Derby, or, that sort of thing, the sort of thing that we didn't really have a beat for, but I would just go on assignment. Sometimes I was on the road for months at a time because I would be on an assignment and I'd get a call from the office and say, now we'd like you to go, you're in LA right now, we'd like you to go to Phoenix. and then after that, they'd say, oh, we want you to go to Columbus, Ohio.
Oh boy.
And so I was bopping around, and I spent a lot of time on the road. And I went back to Washington, D.C., my hometown. and I was an assistant city editor at the Washington Times. And I did that for about a year, I think, or close to a year. And then a good friend of mine that I had worked with in New York named Barry Lorge was at the Washington Post, and he took a job as sports editor at the San Diego Union. There were two newspapers here in San Diego at that time. And he offered me a job as the night sports editor, and then I later became the deputy sports editor. And while in that job, the wine writer was Dan Berger, none other than the great Dan Berger.
Wow.
And Dan left to go to the LA Times. And at that time, the food editor came to me. Everybody knew I was a very serious wine collector. And they said, would you be interested in writing the wine column for us? And at first I turned them down because I said, most of my wine collection is French and Italian wine. Huh. And really heavily on the French wine. Right. I said, I haven't really been here in California enough to really have a grasp, a real good handle on California wine. And I think, you're a big city newspaper in California. You need somebody who really can address California wine as well as the other things. So, right. So I kind of cooled it for about a year. And after about a year, I went back to the food editor and I said, I'm starting to get the hang of this California wine thing. So yeah, I'll take the job. And I took the job. And at the time, the Copley News Service, Copley owned the San Diego Union and the San Diego Tribune. The Copley News Service had a wine writer named Richard Nally.
Of course.
And he was very talented, and they weren't interested in pulling him off the beat, but they liked what I was doing. But at some point, I think he resigned. He quit to go to Departures magazine, right? The American Express publication. Yes. And so they picked up the phone, and Copley News Service did, and called me and said, well, Richard Nally's leaving. Would you like to take over that position? And I said, well, of course I would. And I said, there's one caveat. And I said, what's that? They said, we want you to write more about European wines. You don't have to do it exclusively, but you're really tilted heavily toward California now, and we want you to be a little broader.
The irony.
I said, okay, that's fine by me. Now, I didn't have any problem with the French part of that, but I felt like I was a little remiss in my knowledge of Italian wines. I knew the biggies, but I really didn't understand all of the diversity of Italy and the different indigenous grape varieties. It just, a lot of that went over my head.
Oh, sure. Yeah, it's complicated.
So I made it a point to start spending time in Italy and visiting Italian wine regions. And I would go 3, 4, 5 times a year. And once I got into the groove there, one year I went to Italy 14 times.
Whoa.
There was a woman, she's still around. I don't know that she's still running her, what she called educational tours, but she would do educational tours of Italian wineries for journalists from all over the world. So she would invite me on a trip, and I would go, and there'd be journalists from China, and there'd be somebody from Australia, and maybe somebody from New Zealand, and maybe somebody else from the United States. And we would visit wineries. And then I got to be pretty good friends with Marina, and so I would be on a trip. And so she would come by, and she'd say to me, Roberto, next week we're going to Puglia. Would you like to go to Puglia? I said, Marina, I'd love to go to Puglia, but, I got a non-refundable ticket. I got to go home. So, okay, well, you go home. But, okay, in 2 weeks, we're going to Friuli. Would you like to go to Friuli? And I'd say, okay, Marina, okay, yeah, I'd love to go to Friuli. So I'd fly home, get a new ticket, fly back.
Oh my goodness.
And I did this repeatedly. Those trips were grueling. We'd visit in the course of a week 25, 30 wineries. And if you think that's fun, just try doing it.
It sounds fun.
Just try doing it. And it is fun to a certain extent, but you're working and you're taking notes. And then after the trip, you have to decipher your notes.
Exactly. Well, yeah, that's the hard part.
And it's a lot of information, but I really absorbed a lot. I learned a lot about Italian wine, and I achieved my purpose. And at some point, those trips were just so grueling, and I backed away from that. But what I would do is I would contact Marina from time to time, and I'd say, Marina, I want to go to Tuscany for a week, and I want to visit blah, 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 blah. I don't want to visit more than 2 or 3 wineries a day, and I want the weekends off. I'll fly myself over, but you find me a driver and you put together an itinerary that makes sense, where you can send me to some new places that I may not know, and I can go visit some people I'm dying to visit. And we did that for a number of years, and it was very rewarding. But I had a love affair with Italian wine that persists to this day, even though I don't make as many trips over there as I used to. My initial desire to go over and over and over again was just to cram my head with so much knowledge about Italy. And of course, I enjoyed the Italian cuisine as well.
Of course.
And the culture.
Yeah. And really, that's the best way to learn about wine, is to just dive right in and be there and talk to the winemakers and taste the wines there among the vineyards.
Absolutely. You can't replace that understanding you have of specific wines. You can't replace that with knowledge that you got from reading a book or just from tasting the wine. Those are all good things, but the experience of sitting down with the winemaker, hearing his or her passion, hearing them talk about what they do and why they do what they do. And, it's not like you're hearing the same story over and over again. You could visit in the same day, you could visit 5 wineries and hear 5 different philosophies, and all of them make really good wine, even though they approach it from a different point of view.
Right.
That's one of the things I always found fascinating.
Yeah. And it's one of the beauties of wine, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So anyway, that's how I got from sports to wine. And then at some point, I wanted to transition away from sports completely and do wine full time. And the only way I could do that was to create a revenue stream. And that's why I invented the wine competitions that I do.
Well, that takes me to my next question, because I was wondering how you got into it, because you've been managing wine competitions now for at least 20 years, right?
For 25 years.
25 years, right. So what was your first experience?
It was the Monterey wine competition, and a wonderful PR person from San Francisco named Ed Schwartz had a PR firm and represented a lot of wineries in California. And he was involved with Lockwood Vineyards down in Monterey County. And the people at the Salinas Valley Fair in Monterey County had approached Lockwood and said, we want to start a wine competition. A lot of these other fairs, and this is huge in California, a lot of the fairs have wine competitions. We want to start a wine competition, but we don't know how to do it. Can you find someone who would help us or could help us? And so Ed Schwartz called me and said, would you be interested in helping the folks up in Salinas Valley start a wine competition? So I met with them, and I told them, I had never run one, but I had judged at many wine competitions. So I had very strong ideas about how it should be done. And I said, sure, I'll do it for you. And I ran that competition for 18 years. While I was running it, I also took over the San Diego International at the same time that I started the Critics Challenge. Huh. And now my top assistant, our director, Rich Cook, runs the Monterey Wine Competition.
Right.
So I no longer have to make those long drives up to Monterey County.
Right.
Yeah, Rich does that. So that worked great. I got my feet wet with a smaller wine competition. We started the first year, we had about 500 entries. And before I left, we got it up to over 1,500. And we were doing very, very well. And we took it international. It was strictly domestic,
right.
USA at one time. And then we took it international. And that was by demand. A lot of the wine companies said, we'd like to enter our wine that we bring in from Chile or the wine we bring in from Australia, why don't you think about judging that for us? And so we did.
Sure.
Then I took over San Diego just about 3 months after I had created the Critics Challenge. And Critics Challenge, of course, the idea was to have these colleagues that I work with, people I respected, tasted with. I knew their palates. I knew their dedication. I knew their reliability. And I said, guys, how would you like to judge at a wine competition? And we'll take your tasting notes and edit them down, and we'll publish those. And we pay them a nice fee. I think our fee for the Critics Challenge is probably one of the tops in the industry. And it always has been. It's been a pretty nice fee that we paid the judges. And so between those two, I was cruising along and doing great. And then we hit the recession in 2008, 2009.
Right.
And I knew the wine industry was being hit very, very hard. I could see it, and I could see the anguish in the people who were selling wine. They were devastated. People stopped buying wines over $20 a bottle.
Yeah.
So I thought to myself, that's going to mean that I'm going to have a downturn in entries. But, I'm running a year-round operation. I have a full-time assistant. I have part-timers who work with me. I have rent. I have a warehouse. I need to maintain a certain level of revenue. So I created, this is counterintuitive, going into a recession, I created 2 new wine competitions, and they were themed. Just like Critics was
right.
themed, I created one for sommeliers, where all the judges would be well-known, respected, professional sommeliers, and one for winemakers. And all of the judges are winemakers that I've come into contact with through the years, that I have a lot of respect for what they do. And that was the one that was the hardest to convince people to enter, because they thought, oh, winemakers are just going to be so hard on these young wines. But actually, winemakers taste young wines all the time. You think about it, they're going through their cellar and they're tasting barrel samples and wines that aren't quite ready yet. And so they get that. And what we have found over the years, because winemaker in January, that will be its 10th year too. What we found over the years that percentage-wise, they give out just about the same number of medals as the Sommeliers or the group that forms the San Diego International, which is a combination of wine professionals and winemakers and sommeliers and wine journalists. And then the critics. I look at the numbers after every competition, and they're very similar, and we're very lucky, because when I first started judging wine competitions, there were a lot of really bad wines out there. Right. Not just mediocre. I mean, bad.
Just bad. Right.
Wines. An expression came up, not in my mouth. Like you would smell it and say, not in my mouth. You wouldn't even taste the wine. So, but that goes back to like the early 1980s. Yeah. And we've just seen this revolution in viticulture and winemaking skill and technology at the winery level, at the cellar level, that has uplifted wines. We're seeing wines, for example, here in California, coming from Lodi that are really dynamite, very, very nice. Where 30 years ago, you would have thought Lodi is just too hot. All you can do is grow table grapes there. And if you make wine, it's going to be jug wine.
Right.
And, and it's just going to be cheap wine that you put out there because you can't afford anything else. And that's just no longer the case. And I know you have witnessed that in Italy. I've seen it all over France. I traveled France now about anywhere from 4 to 6 times a year. And every other year, I try to make a trip down to the Languedoc region. And the Languedoc at one time was considered, pretty mediocre stuff. The problem with that opinion was that it was flat out wrong. There were a lot of great vineyards in the Languedoc. Right. With 80-year-old vines, 100-year-old vines. Wow. But after World War II, a lot of the men were gone. They had been killed. Mm-hmm. And the families that maintained these vineyards basically fell into the trap of selling these wonderful grapes to the co-ops. So the really great grapes from these old vines would go into blends with overcropped wines, overcropped vineyards.
Right.
Yeah, the wines weren't that good. They were kind of bland and boring and sometimes bad. But I saw a renaissance 20 years ago, maybe even 25 years ago, where some sharp people in the south of France realized that there was potential there, and they started buying up these wonderful old vineyards and making phenomenal wine. And now the wines from the Languedoc are terrific. And I spent some vacation time, not every year, but maybe every other year, in the south of France, and I drink Languedoc wines all the time.
It's amazing.
And we've seen the same thing in Italy.
Yeah.
Where areas that weren't considered, like the Veneto.
Right.
Valpolicella.
Right.
When I first started drinking wine, Valpolicella, you could pour a glass of Valpolicella, and it was so light in color, you could read the newspaper through it.
It was.
and that's all changed. Valpolicella now is a wonderful wine, and prices are pretty reasonable. And that's the amazing thing to me about Tuscany, where the land is so expensive. You can still buy just regular generic Chianti or Chianti Classico, which is, in my opinion, a step up. Yeah. And even some of the Reservas for under $20 a bottle. And these are phenomenal wines, especially from good vintages. And here's the thing about Italy. I don't think that the incidence of bad vintages is as regular as it used to be.
No, I would agree.
People have learned how to deal with the weather. And part of that is, and this is controversial, part of that is in Tuscany, for example. They planted a fair amount of Merlot because Merlot ripens early and it gets in before the rains.
Right. Yeah.
So if you've got Sangiovese that's a little washed out because it wasn't ripe before the rains came, then you can plump it up with the Merlot that you've already got in the tank.
Right.
Is that a bad thing? I don't think so.
No, I don't think so.
I think that's a great thing. And on top of that, I think Tuscany is one of the sweet spots in the world for growing Merlot.
It really is.
I've had some beautiful Merlot from Tuscany.
Yeah.
So anyway, enough pontificating.
No, but it actually leads me into, the whole importance of competitions really is because I came into the industry about 20 years ago. And I was just coming in when all this technology and the quality of wine was really starting to be really consistent. And I'm looking back and you're right. It's actually difficult to make a bad wine these days. I mean, there were still some bad wines. Like today, every wine is good. And that because of that, there's a lot of competition. There's probably 2,500 different Pinot Grigios in the United States. It's so how do you separate your wine from somebody else's wine? And one of those ways you can do it is enter your wine into a competition and see how it ranks, right? I mean, that's one of the ways you can do that.
Yeah, it's a third-party affirmation of the quality of wine. Same thing as a wine review. But see, not every wine, there are so many wines in the world, not every wine gets reviewed.
Right.
And so if you've got that other tool in your box when it comes to marketing your wine, if you can say, and let's face it, who doesn't want to say that the wines they make are award-winning?
Of course.
Most everyone wants to. Well, you can't say you're an award-winning wine or winery if you don't win some awards, and that's so you gotta bite the bullet. And you have to spend the money. You got to send the samples in and take your chances. And when I say take your chances, we give out a very high percentage of medals. It's usually in the 60 to 65% range.
Right.
But there are good wines that don't medal. And when somebody cries on my shoulder about that, they call me and they say, what happened? We know it's a good wine and blah, blah, blah. And I try to explain to them, when the wine goes into the bottle, its curve from the time it went into the bottle to peak maturity is not a straight line curve that goes up. It has peaks and valleys. And for example, years ago, I was living in La Jolla, and I lived right across the street from a great restaurant called George's at the Cove. I took a Richebourg in for the Thanksgiving dinner, and we tasted it, and it's like, it's a Grand Cru Burgundy. It's flat. Nothing's happening. It's not giving us anything. So I thought, okay, well, and I lived right across the street. I put the cork back in the bottle, and I gave it to the sommelier, and I said, here, you take this home. And I went across the street, went into my wine cellar, and I got another bottle of wine, and I brought that over, and we enjoyed it, and it was great. But 6 months later, I said, I'm going to try that Richebourg again. So I opened another bottle because I typically buy, a half case or a case of whatever it is I'm buying. So I pulled another bottle, and it was absolutely glorious. But that one bottle that I tried to serve at Thanksgiving, or I did serve at Thanksgiving, it was dumb. It had gone into one of those phases where it wasn't showing you its character. It wasn't showing you its fruit. It wasn't doing what you would expect of a Grand Cru Burgundy.
Right.
And we see that with young wines all the time. They go into the bottle and maybe for 2 months they taste great. And then they kind of dumb down for a little bit and they pop up and they pop down and they pop up and they pop down. And so that's why I encourage people, if you're going to enter wine competitions, enter a number of wine competitions, because your wine isn't always going to taste the same. It's not that it's going to be flawed one time and not flawed the other time, but it may not jump out of the glass at the judges.
Right.
Because it has these peaks and valleys. So if you're serious about using competition awards to help you market your wine, you really need to take not entirely a shotgun approach, but a little bit of a shotgun approach so that you give it some time. And I'll give you another example. One of our winemakers who judges at Winemaker Challenge is a brilliant winemaker named Adam Lazar. And he worked up in Monterey County for a number of different wineries, but he also created his own label. And one of the first vintages of his Pinot Noir, he entered it in the Monterey Wine Competition and got a silver medal. And he was pretty happy with that. But I tasted the wine and I said, Adam, you entered that in San Diego, and it's just really closed right now. You give that another 2 months, and I bet you it's going to pop. I bet you that wins a gold medal. And so he did. He entered it in the San Diego competition, and the judges unanimously gave it a gold medal.
There you go.
And it just, it's just at that stage of its development, it wasn't quite showing everything it had. That's the downside of entering a competition. You don't always get what you're looking for. And I'll use one of your wines as an example. Brunello from Banffy. I tasted that. The judges come to their own conclusion. And when they assign a wine the Platinum Award, then Rich Cook, our director and my top assistant, and we go taste all of the Platinum wines.
Right.
And so I'm tasting this Brunello, and Rich says to me, yeah, that's the Brunello from Banffy. And I said, well, this is amazing. It's got to be one of their, because, you have some special segments of the vineyard and whatnot and some special bottlings. And they said, no, this is just their regular Brunello. I said, my God, this is one of the best I've ever tasted. So, it just jumped out of the glass at me, and that happens. And apparently it happened to the judges on the panel that sent it up to us as a platinum award.
Yeah. Sometimes the timing is lucky.
Well, yeah. And, and we taste the platinums, and we find, by and large, we're in agreement with the judges. Occasionally we disagree, but that's the nature of critiquing wines. One of the things that I try to do, especially with the Critics Challenge, is I try to put judges who have what I call an Eastern United States or European palate. Right. I match them with judges that I think are more in line with a California palate, where they like richer, more full-bodied wines. I match them with judges who like leaner, more austere wines that are built for the long haul. And I find that balance really works well on these panels. So I fine-tune who goes on what panel.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I wanted to talk to you about. You touched on a little bit how with the Critics Challenge, you choose people that you're very, you respect and they know about wine. And with all three challenges, the winemaker, the critics, and the winemaker and sommelier, how do you really go about choosing people and recruiting them and getting them in? Like, is there something about, or is it always somebody you know? Do people ever come to you and say, hey, I'd like to be a judge? Or
they do. And when I accept a judge that's new that I'm not really familiar with and haven't tasted with, what I do is I always have judges there that are people I've known for 20, 25, 30 years. And I trust them implicitly, and I put the new judge with them, and I know I'll get honest feedback.
Right.
How did the judge do? And I also know that I've got two judges there who can carry the person if they're not quite up to the standards that we're looking for. And now with sommeliers, a little bit different. When I started sommelier, I had Jesse Rodriguez, who's a famous sommelier.
Yeah, of course.
He was at French Laundry, and he was at Addison down here in San Diego, and he's now in South Carolina. And he helped me recruit the sommeliers, and I recruited some that I knew personally. Now I pretty much turn over all of the recruitment of sommeliers because he knows all the up and coming people and whatnot. And he brings in fabulous people from Las Vegas and Washington, D.C. and New York and Napa Valley and San Francisco. I mean, he's at L.A. He's plugged in, and he knows all of the good people, and he does a great job of recruiting sommeliers for me. So I pretty much just turn that over to Jesse, and occasionally I'll want to try someone, and I'll say, hey, Jesse, take a look at blah, blah, blah. And, we'll bring in somebody new. But for the other three competitions, I pick the judges. I pick people I've worked with. I pick people I know, or if I try a new judge, I always put them on a panel with really experienced judges that I trust to give me honest feedback about how they're doing.
Right.
If they don't do well, I don't bring them back.
Right. So if someone who is listening is interested in judging at some point, what kind of advice can you give them as far as training, experience, where they should start, like how they should, what is the process of becoming?
The one thing that you should know, if you're going to judge wines, you're going to be tasting over the course of a couple of days, anywhere from 150 to 200, or even if you do the San Francisco International, you'll do 200 wines in one day.
Wow.
You need to have your palate calibrated. You need to be someone who tastes on a regular basis, at least 5 days a week, and you sit down and taste 10, 12 wines at a time. Now, even though you're going to taste more at a competition, the calibration is what's really important. These judges who are real wine pros and have been doing it for a long time, they get into a groove. And, I always tell them this, but it's my own personal philosophy. You walk into someone's house and they hand you a glass of wine. You didn't see them pour it out of the bottle. You take one sip. You know immediately if they poured you something good or not.
Right.
You don't need to think about it for half an hour. You don't need to retaste it 20 times. Yeah. It just, and if you taste wines as often as I do, 5 days a week, we taste anywhere from 12 to 20 wines. Immediately when you put it in your mouth. You don't have to, really, it's just, you smell it, you make sure that there are no problems with the nose, and then you taste it. And, I'm maybe lucky, but I think that there are plenty of people who do exactly what I do. I put a wine in my mouth and I immediately calibrate the structure of the wine. the balance of the acidity in the fruit and the amount of oak and whether the oak is integrated and what the tannin structure is and whether or not it's wood tannin or grape tannin, because there's a difference and it really affects the quality of the wine, especially as you age it. If you have too strong a wood tannin, those wood tannins don't age out. And when the fruit in the wine diminishes, you'll get 10, 12 years down the road. And what you taste when you open one of those wines is wood tannin.
Right.
So I would say to somebody who's interested in becoming a judge, first of all, practice.
Of course.
So that when you actually convince someone to, give you a shot, that you can pull your weight.
Right.
I typically give 50 to 55 wines for a panel in every session, and we typically do 3 sessions. So over the course of one of my wine competitions, in 3 days, you're going to taste 160 wines. And that's not too many. In fact, the real pros will just breeze through them, and then they're done and they're ready for lunch.
Yeah.
Okay. But like I said, Rich and I taste all of the platinums, and, we think our judges do a pretty darn good job.
Yeah. When you're tasting that many wines, even if it's not a competition, if it's just a professional sommelier or whoever that has to taste wines, what are some things that you do to kind of combat palate fatigue?
I know judges will taste some roast beef if they're getting a lot of tannin from red wines. Mm-hmm. There's a following out there for these pickles that people will taste, and some people will taste cheese. I find that alters your perception of the wine.
Yeah.
I don't do it. I don't do it. I drink water.
Just water. Okay.
That's it.
All right.
I just drink water and
time.
Yeah. But I think that's part of palate training. You look at a winemaker, for example. Winemaker is after harvest. He's got all these wine in barrels and wine in tanks and whatnot. Well, he's got to keep track. He has to keep track of these wines as they evolve to know how they're progressing, whether or not there's a problem, when he might think about bottling, and, the whole litany of things that a winemaker has to do in the cellar. And so a winemaker goes through the cellar with his clipboard, and he's tasting 50 or 60 wines. And you know what? It's his job. He has to do it. He can't take a break and say, well, no, when he's got hundreds of barrels.
Yeah. That's right.
And maybe, hundreds of tanks.
Yeah.
So it's a job, and you train your palate to do it, and you work through it.
Interesting.
Yeah, I don't think it's an issue for a real wine professional.
Right. It's something you just learn. It's a skill that you develop over the years, I guess.
Absolutely. Yeah.
So walk me through the process of how a wine is judged at one of your competitions, like from beginning to end.
Well, first of all, a wine is entered and it's shipped to us, and it comes to our warehouse where I'm sitting right now. And we have an office staff that will open the boxes and check all the wines, and they make a printout of the entries, and they check in the wines. They're looking for discrepancies, the wrong vintage or whatnot. And then we have a software system that allows us to print out identification labels for each bottle of wine, and each entry has its own unique code. So it's the code label goes on the bottle, and that's how we keep track of it throughout its time in our cellar and through the wine competition. Okay. So then when we arrive at the time of flighting, we use those unique codes to organize the flights and create wine flights. Right. And we also print out stickers that match the codes on the bottle for each glass that the wine's going to go into. And you could have 3 judges on a panel. You could have 4 judges on a panel. Sometimes you have a sticker. You sticker 3 or 4 glasses. And when you go to pour the wine into the glass, there are 2 people standing there, and they read out the code on the bottle and match it to the code on the glass so that we know that the right wine goes into the right glass.
Right.
Then there's another crew that comes and picks up the flight of wine, puts it on trays, and takes it out to a room where the judges are at tables throughout the room. Like I said, 3 to 4 per table. And there's a table monitor there who keeps score of what the judges vote on all of the wines. And they put the glasses down, and the judges have a sheet in front of them that tells them, it has the numbers. It doesn't tell them what the wine is, who the producer is, what the price is, no information like that. They're judging the wine on its merits.
Okay.
And then they discuss among themselves, the merits of the wine. And some people may like it more than others, and they'll push a little bit harder to get it a higher medal or a higher rating, because on gold and platinum wines, we assign a numerical score. And this information is transferred to the table monitor, who then transfers it to the computer room, and the awards are entered into the system. And, the rest is history. We publish it, and we go back and we audit the results. We make sure that the judges' score sheets match what the table monitor put on her score sheet and what we put into the system. So that's why it typically takes a day or sometimes 2 days before we post the results, because we go back and we double check to make sure that everything was transcribed properly. We encourage judges to understand that they're tasting a lot of wines at one time. So focus on that one wine that you're putting in your mouth at that moment and think about nothing else. And do the best you can to be as generous and understanding that these are commercial wines.
Right.
These are not handcrafted cult wines.
Right.
Generally, they're not. Handcrafted cult wines that are selling for $1,500 a bottle. These are commercial wines that are premium commercial wines. They retail for anything from $10 up to $200 a bottle.
Right.
I think we get pretty good results. And it's so different from when I first started judging in wine competitions, when the judges were all so competitive about who knew more and who was the more famous wine expert and whose knowledge superseded someone else's knowledge. And we seem to have, over the years, weeded out the bad apples who like to let their egos get in the way of the judging.
Sure.
And right now, I would say that on most panels, there is tremendous synergy and tremendous camaraderie. And it's almost like a reunion, because a lot of our judges judge in other competitions. And so they see people, maybe they're not on the same panel, but they see people that they know, and then they come to our competition and they reunite with some of their friends. And there's a tremendous level of camaraderie and respect for the product and respect for the differences of opinion that you're going to have when you're sitting there having a glass of wine. I mean, look, if you and I sat down and we had a flight of 10 wines in front of us, we would probably come very close to agreeing on the grouping of wines that were a little higher quality and a little lesser quality. But when it got down to splitting hairs over the 3 or 4 that we liked the most, I might like wine A best and you might like wine D best.
Right.
Now, that's just natural.
Sure.
So what you want is that respect that goes with going along and making compromises and saying, yeah, okay, I see what you're saying. This wine deserves that gold medal.
Right. So when the wine is being tasted and being judged, it's essentially just being judged for just against itself. It's not really being judged against other wines. It's just how that wine is tasting at that moment and whether or not the judge thinks it's silver, gold, platinum, or no medal.
Well, here's where the varying opinions come in. You will give a high score to a wine that really tastes great now, but you might acknowledge that this is not a wine that's built for the long haul. And then you may taste another wine, and this is where Italian wines get tricky. A lot of Italian wines, because they're higher in acidity,
right,
and they're structured to actually get better. But a lot of people don't realize that Sangiovese, some of the best Sangiovese producers, when their wines are 12, 15, 20 years old, they're amazing. And we see this in Brunello.
Right.
And aged Brunello is just phenomenal. And so you have to strike a balance on the panel between understanding that a wine that's showy now is equally deserving of an award as a wine that's built for the long haul, but isn't quite as showy right now. So you get a little yin and yang going on there. And so it's not like every wine has to have forward fruit and be really showy now. And every wine doesn't have to have that structure that tells you, oh, this is going to age well for 20 years. You can give a gold medal to either or both. Because it's good in the style, and that's how we encourage our judges to vote. Is it a legitimate style, and is it well made in that style?
Okay. So when the judges are tasting, they're tasting blind in that they don't know who the producer is, but are they aware that they're tasting a Brunello or they're tasting a Cabernet from Napa, or
yes,
is that how they're kind of?
Well, no, they're not. They wouldn't know that they're tasting a Cabernet from Napa.
Oh,
they would know that they're tasting a Cabernet Sauvignon.
Oh, okay. Okay.
But when it comes to the European wines, we tell them it's a Bordeaux, or we tell them it's a Burgundy, or we tell them it's a wine from Tuscany, or we tell them it's a wine from Southern Italy.
Okay.
Because I think, giving a little context for that is important.
Very interesting.
The thing is, we want to remove as much bias as possible.
Right.
So if you said, look, why do Cabernets from Napa Valley cost more than Cabernets from Sonoma County? Because there's a perceived difference in quality. So the judges are aware of that. Judges live in that environment. So if they taste a wine and they're told it's from Napa Valley, subconsciously, they might automatically give it a little more credibility than a wine that's every bit as good that's from Livermore Valley or Sonoma County or Mendocino or whatnot. So we eliminate that level of bias. But when you judge a Brunello, you're only tasting Brunellos. So you're judging Brunellos within the context of what's a Brunello taste like, what's a good Brunello, blah, blah, blah.
Right. And with all the care that you take in choosing the judges and making sure that they're tasting the right things, I'm imagining that whoever is going to be tasting a Brunello has a pretty good experience with Italian wines or...
Exactly. I put together specifically panels that have some expertise in the wines that we're going to assign them. And for that reason, a lot of wine competitions will, for example, with sparkling wine, spread the sparkling wine throughout the room so that everybody gets a little bit of sparkling wine. And I feel that you get uneven results when you do that. I want the same panel that has expertise that I'm aware of in sparkling wine production. I want all of the sparkling wines tasted by the same panel so that they can calibrate for the sparkling wine and taste the wines in context. Same thing with a Brunello or a Bordeaux. But categories like, let's just say, domestic Cabernet Sauvignon, we get 200, 300 entries. You're not going to bury one panel with that. All they know is I've got Cabernet. So they might get 30, they might get 40 Cabernets, but those Cabernets are going to be spread among panels throughout the room.
Right.
With our Italian entries and French entries, we can usually, because we don't get overwhelmed with them, I mean, we just don't.
Right.
We can usually keep all of the Brunellos, all of the Valpolicellas, all of the Proseccos. Well, Prosecco goes in with the sparkling, but you see what I'm saying? We can keep that within one panel.
Yeah. Some of your competitions, they have 1,400, 1,500 entries. I mean, that's an amazing amount of wines to manage. It's, kudos to you for how you can do that.
The way I look at it is we do about 5,000 entries a year. And we offer, I love it when a winery enters every single competition, but we also know that people have, winemakers, sometimes marketing people have certain, ideas about who would be best to taste their wine. And
I'm sure.
So, for example, we get a tremendous number of sparkling wines for the San Diego International and for the Winemaker Challenge, but we only get a tremendous number of champagne in the sparkling category for Sommelier Challenge and Critics Challenge.
Interesting.
So the champagne producers have decided that if they're going to send their wines to a competition, they want wine critics to taste them or they want sommeliers to taste them.
Right.
So we occasionally will get champagne in the other two competitions, but that's rare.
Right. I kind of understand that because being, in PR and marketing myself, I can see like if my wine wins an award and it says it's from a sommelier competition, for whatever reason, it feels like it holds a little more weight because the sommeliers are seen as such,
But I would think that having winemakers adore your wine would carry some weight too. And I would also think having critics love your wine would carry some weight. So that's why I created all of those different options for people.
Of course.
So
well, Robert, that's why we enter all of your competitions, to be quite frank.
I want all of them to be tempting.
Yes.
For whatever reason. And the other thing is wines are released at different times of the year.
Right.
So you have a year-round cycle and changes of vintages so that by the time you get around the Sommelier Challenge in September, they're tasting a different vintage from the same producer that somebody at Winemaker Challenge tasted in January.
Right. Yeah.
There's been a changeover in the vintages. So we get a lot of that too.
Yeah. I go back to the fact that there are so many wines out there and putting your wine into a competition makes a lot of sense. I sometimes get some I don't want to call it negative feedback. I sometimes get some pushback when I say, oh, our wine just won a gold medal at whatever it was. And they're like, oh, but I need the 90-point score from such and such magazine. And you know what? At the end of the day, the consumer goes to the shelf and they see 15 different Cabernets from Sonoma or, 35 different Pinot Grigios. Having a gold medal from anywhere, it could be the point of difference and makes the consumer pull that off the shelf.
Well,
so,
I do. And I believe that firmly, or I wouldn't be doing what I'm doing.
Exactly.
And I know that many winemakers, especially here in California, have told me that when they win a gold medal, their wine club sells out of the wine. It makes a huge impact on their ability to sell that wine. So,
yeah.
And the other thing is many competitions, including mine, although I do believe I was the first, my competitions now give assigned scores because we know that a lot of wine salespeople and wine buyers want to know what score did it get.
Yes.
So we give scores, and Platinum Award is 94 points and higher. Gold medal is 90 through 93 points. And the silver medal, we don't assign a score. We'll let everyone assume it was 89 or 90 points.
Right.
But we give point scores for gold and platinum. And we have found that is very popular. We see those scores get promoted all the time. And, I go into tasting rooms all over California when I'm up in Napa and Sonoma and Monterey County, and I will see on the shelf there, gold medal, 92 points, Critics Challenge.
There you go.
Yeah. So.
Yeah, that was a brilliant move. And thank you for doing that because it is a big help. It really is. And so. Well,
the other thing that we do that I won't call it unique to us. We were the ones who started it with Critics Challenge is we provide some tasting notes, and then we take it a step beyond that. And all of the Platinum Award wines are reviewed at Wine Review Online by either Rich Cook, Michael Franz, or myself. Right. And we think that that's a real added value thing. Some other wine competitions will have tasting notes, but they're not attributed to any specific individual.
Right.
It just says, here's what the judges said.
Right.
And I think it's more valuable to know that this came from Wayne Belding, who's a master sommelier, or that came from Michael Franz, who's a renowned wine writer.
I agree. It's a nice connection.
Or even Robert Whitley. Yes.
Who knows a thing or two about wine.
I just keep practicing. That's all.
So you were judging wine competitions before you managed them. What kind of things did you take from your experience that you learned from that maybe you've applied or maybe that you feel make your competitions a little different or unique from any others? I know we've covered a lot of all of the differentiations already, but is there anything in particular?
Well, there are a couple of things that I will take credit for innovating, although I'm not 100% sure that people didn't do them before I did, is when I first started judging, you would have one panel do all the Chardonnay, and you would have one panel do all the Sauvignon Blanc, and so on. And you wear people out with that. And I decided at some point that really wasn't fair to the wines. I want to spread these large categories that have 200, 300 entries. I want to spread them around and let a lot of different people take a look at those wines. And that has been universally adopted in almost every wine competition that I know of. That was one of the biggies. We kind of spread that around. Oh, another thing, I discussed this with the late David Lake, who was a master of wine and founded Columbia Winery up in Washington. We talked about the possibility after I took over San Diego of flipping the order of tasting. It had been traditional at almost every wine competition to taste the white wines in the morning and then the red wines in the afternoon. The theory being that, you build your way up to the red wines.
Right.
But David and I felt that your palate was sharper in the morning.
Right.
And very serious, highly structured, complex red wines needed the best your palate could give it. So we flipped the tasting order, and we do the red wines in the morning and we do the white wines in the afternoon. And the added benefit of that is now when you taste the white wines, they're so refreshing after tasting red wines all morning. And it's worked very well. And now I see that many other wine competitions are adopting that philosophy of tasting red first and white later. And when Rich Cook and I taste for review purposes here in the office, we always taste the reds first.
Yeah.
And then we taste the whites. And I think the whites get a better shake because they hit your palate and it's refreshing. It's a welcome thing, you know.
Yeah.
So I think we're doing a great service for white wine criticism.
I think that's brilliant. It's interesting you bring that up because I've spoken to some of my friends over at Wine Spectator and Wine Enthusiast, and they tend to do all of their tasting in the morning, regardless of whether it's red or white, because they feel like that's when their palate is the sharpest. So that's pretty interesting that you do that with the competition.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, in a competition, you've got to build it into the day. Now,
right.
The one competition that I've judged at that I really like their format, but we don't do it. They've got judges in for a week is the Concours Mondial. And Concours Mondial, you'll taste 50 wines in the morning, you break for lunch, and then they put you on a bus and they take you someplace out in the countryside and you visit wineries.
Wow.
So you don't taste in the afternoon.
That's nice.
That is nice. So, but no, we taste in the morning, we taste in the afternoon, and we have found that the judges like it, and I think we get better results.
Yeah.
When we go white wine first, red wine later.
Yeah.
And we also taste the sparkling wines in the afternoon. So reds all morning, and then whites and sparkling in the afternoon.
Nice.
So,
well, Robert, I think you do a fantastic job with all of your competitions, and it really is a great service to the industry. And I really thank you so much for joining us today. As I mentioned, the Sommelier Challenge the deadline is coming up. You missed the early bird. The deadline's coming up. I guess it's August 17th.
August 17th. Yeah.
Yeah. So if you're listening to this before then,
I will confess we take wines after the final deadline. You know, Rebecca Murphy, who ran she founded the Dallas Morning News Wine Competition and ran it for many years. Right. She used to have a saying. Somebody on the cellar crew would say, oh, blah, 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 just delivered this late entry. Is it too late? And she would say, have we flighted the wines yet? And they would say, no. And she'd say, it's not too late.
and don't forget, and did the check clear?
Yeah, exactly. No.
All right. Yeah. So we have Sommelier Challenge coming up in September. So look out for that. And then I believe it's going to be the Winemaker Challenge.
Winemaker in January, and then San Diego International has been in March for a number of years, but we're moving it to April this year. And Critics Challenge has been Memorial Weekend in May. We're moving that to the first weekend in June this year, just to give us a little more spacing between the competitions and make it a little easier on our office staff.
Great. That'll be a help to me too. So,
okay.
I know we can find you at all the different competition websites. Where can people find and communicate with you?
Well, they can email me at witonwine@aol.com or whitleyonwine@yahoo.com. All that information is on the Wine Review Online website.
Great.
And there's, a picture of me at the bottom of the page. You could click on it, and it shows all of my reviews and columns going back 15 years.
Great. And I will also put links in the show notes so that you can see all of the information about all the competitions and all about Robert.
Terrific.
Look for that in the show notes. So, Robert, thanks so much. Really appreciate it.
Okay. Keep doing a great job.
Thanks. You too.
Thank you for listening to Wine Biz 360. Do you have a sales story, question, or want to be a guest on the show? Visit winebiz360.com and let us know.